Welcome to the Kentucky History Channel, where we strive to bring you all the Kentucky history content you want and you deserve. Kentucky is a part of all of us, and we plan on covering all the history we can, from Pike County to Fulton County, from Louisville to Harlan. Here on our YouTube channel, you can find many videos dedicated to different events, people, governors, and places in Kentucky. There's something for everybody. While you're here, if you like the channel, hit the subscribe button and the notification button so you get notified anytime new Kentucky history is available. And if you want to support the channel, we have a Patreon page as well, or patreon.com/kyhistorypod. You've probably heard about Daniel Boone, but what about the rest of the frontiersmen who came to Kentucky and settled? That's what we want to bring to the Kentucky History Channel. The stories of the untold, the stories of those forgotten. One thing to expect on our channel is great Kentucky content. Some stories that you've never heard of. The Night Riders, who began in western Kentucky. Bloody Monday, the riots in Louisville. The assassination of Governor Goebel, the only governor ever assassinated in the United States. Stories from all over Kentucky, stories that are unforgettable once you've heard them. You can find out who counties in Kentucky are named after and how your county got started. From beginning to end, we plan to document every county in Kentucky, all 120. Reach out to us on all of our social media platforms. Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And also leave a comment on one of our YouTube videos. You can also check out our podcast episodes. You can subscribe to our podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and many more. Welcome back to the Kentucky History Podcast. I'm your host, Jameson Cable, and I have another great guest here with me, David Kirkpatrick, who is a Kentucky native and has written a book, The War of 1812 in the West. David, thanks for joining us. How you doing?
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. Doing great tonight.
Good. Awesome. Yep. We're here on a nice Kentucky night. It's been a little cold, but hey, that's okay. It's it's a Kentucky weather, right?
That's right. It'll change. So,
before we get too much into it, tell us about your Kentucky connection. You know, you live in Kentucky, born and raised, or tell us all that stuff.
I grew up in primarily Washington County, Kentucky. And so Springfield's the county seat in a little town called Willisburg. But my family's been in Kentucky for 4 or 5 generations. And I grew up with a grandmother who loved to tell stories about Kentucky history. And that's what fostered my love in the subject. So I've got 2 degrees in history, and I spent about a decade working at the Department for Libraries and Archives in Frankfort as an archivist there, and got to handle Kentucky's history on a daily basis. And that was phenomenal. And I currently am the local history and genealogy librarian at Mercer County Public Library, and I serve as assistant director there. But it's the oldest community in the state, and so I've got to carry on with that some. And I've just really enjoyed it because there's so much to unpack in Kentucky history.
I agree, man. I assume, I know. You've been to Fort Herod, a great place right there in Mercer County.
Oh,
yeah. I took my kids there a while back. I don't have the picture to show. I should upload it and show it because it's hilarious. Because I took my nephew and my son. They're 7 and 8 and 9. My daughter's 9. But this was about a year or so ago, right after COVID. We were able to get out and go, and we went. And my nephew and my son just loved it. You know, they're getting their guns, running around, all that kind of stuff. And I took a picture right before we left. And we were standing next to one of the monuments, and my daughter is sitting there like this.
I understand.
She got her hand on her chin, and you can tell she's like, "This was the worst experience ever." But my nephew, my son, they both got their guns up blazing, and they're posing. They thought it was awesome. But anyway, that's a side story. It is Kentucky history. I tell you, man. Once we get off, I might have to pick your brain more. I mean,
Sure.
I mean, there's so much history. Washington County as well, Springfield, Lincoln, all that good stuff.
Right.
Which every county tries to claim Lincoln for
I
something.
think you're right.
Lincoln County, which is where I'm at, we took his name about 50 years earlier. But
Yeah. Yeah, that's right.
But anyway, you got quite a bit, man. I mean, the Historia up in Frankfurt stuff, man. You probably dealt with some really cool stuff.
Oh, it is a neat place. Yeah, they've got 100,000 cubic feet of records, and it's mundane stuff to the super exciting. And with the
Yeah.
War of 1812, they've got some original records that are written from places like New Orleans and then that sort of thing. So it's just fascinating.
Yeah. Well, I was up in Frankfurt a few weeks ago for Veterans Day and did some documentation at the Veterans or the State Mound or
Oh,
mound in Frankfurt Cemetery. But I was there with Russ Carson of Family Tree Nuts, and we were talking about. I mean, we could walk around Frankfurt for days with history
that's right.
stuff just everywhere. I mean,
Oh,
it's
yeah.
everywhere, and which I mean makes sense. It's the capital, but. And I say that, and I turn around and think, well, I'm in Lincoln County. I can go to Harrodsburg. I can go to Stanford. I can go to
Yeah.
Danville in 5 minutes. Crab Orchard. There's
Right.
actually quite a bit around here. I guess I've just seen it so much. It's not as appealing
pop
as
out.
that I've seen it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this book, let me get started. What just compelled you to write about the War of 1812? Because whenever you look at history or you talk to people about history, you got the Revolutionary War, you got the Civil War.
Right.
Sometimes everything in between, War of 1812, one of those things is just kind of forgotten about. I mean,
Oh, absolutely.
so what drew you to this one?
Well, it was an accident. And I say that because I was working in Frankfurt at the time, and I was abstracting some papers from Governor Isaac Shelby, who was first and fifth governor in the state. And I came across something sort of neat for early 19th century politicians. Sometimes they would keep letter books, and they had a received letters book, and they had a book for outgoing letters. So whenever you sent a letter, you had a copy of it recorded in book A. And whenever you received one, that was recorded in book B. So if you put those together, you can follow a conversation. And when you see paintings from this time or anything like that, people look very stiff and, very inhuman. Yeah. But reading those letters together and the conversations backwards and forwards, I thought, well, this is neat. So I started going on my spare time. The project wound up. I moved on to something else. But I would spend my lunch breaks putting these in order. Or I would come in a few minutes early, or I would stay a few minutes late. And I was creating a list. And some of this doesn't make sense to me. I don't quite understand. So I would get other sources and go down to the Historical Society in Frankfurt and pick up some books. And as I laced those pieces together, it got longer and longer. And I thought, I bet this could be a paper or something. And it grew a bit more. And I thought, well, I think we'll try to make it a book. So that's how we came to this point.
There you go. Well, that happens many times. I think you would call that a rabbit hole, right? You went into a rabbit hole.
Climb out.
Yeah. Well, that's one of my problems is I get on a rabbit hole, but then I see a squirrel and I go down another rabbit hole, and I was like, I gotta focus on one at a time.
I can relate.
And that's how it goes. Well, I mean, you bring up Isaac Shelby, very interesting. Person in Kentucky history, first governor and fifth governor, and it was pretty much reelected as the fifth governor because of the War of 1812.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Yeah, Shelby had said he would not run a second time. He'd been approached, and as the drums of war kind of sounded, and he said, "No, I'm retired from public life. Only if there was some sort of major disaster would I, allow my name to be put forward." And sure enough, there was one, and so we get that second term.
Yeah, and I mean, it went. I mean, I don't know. I guess I'll refer to you. It went pretty good for him, I guess, as far as the war for his cause, and I find it very interesting. And we'll probably talk about this a little later. That he rode in battle with his men.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely at the Battle of the Thames, and I always bring that up to people. Imagine a governor today of either party willing to join the Kentucky National Guard and deploy. And I mean, This was, as you said, this was not, I'm perched on a hill with my, spyglass looking down on the battle. This was in line with the infantry, and he was ready to march forward. So that's pretty, and 68 years old at the time. So that's pretty good.
Yeah, he's definitely not a young fella or a young buck if you want to say that.
That's right.
He's got some age on him. So I guess let's kind of begin with just the War of 1812 in general. You know, France isn't involved per se in the battles here in America,
Mm.
but they have an influence because they're involved with Britain, and Britain is the main um, conflict or antagonist, however you want to refer to it as, them along with the Native Americans.
Yeah.
So, give us a brief, well, or take as long as you want, description or how this all came about in the first place.
Well, to look at the causes of the War of 1812, people start at different years. Some people start at 1811. Some people go farther back than that. But you really do have to look at the conflict, like you mentioned, between Britain and France. Neither country wants to let Americans sell goods overseas. And this kind of sours relations between us and several European nations. But Britain, on top of that, was willing to sell arms and ammunition to natives in the Indiana Territory, the Illinois Territory, the recently christened state of Ohio, and those were being used against Americans. And then on top of that, Britain had a policy of removing sailors from American ships that, in theory, used to be British and that had fled their post and gone AWOL. The problem was a good 4,000 to 7,000 of the people they took off American vessels were not British sailors, they were Americans, and the British simply needed the manpower. So all of these factors accumulate and cause issues for Kentucky, whether you're trying to sell your goods at sea and no one in New Orleans wants to buy the corn you're raising because they can't get it to market, or whether it's because you had a neighbor who was assassinated, on his doorstep. All of that led into American support for the war. In almost everywhere except New England. New England was vehemently against it. But here in Kentucky, it was almost universal.
Yeah, yeah. And don't forget the selling of the bourbon down the river, I'm sure. Was it?
Yeah, oh yeah, that's another form of corn.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, well, that, and the whole conflict as a whole, I mean, probably, I guess it ends technically in around the end of 1814, but there's still some skirmishes, back in those days. No one was able to get on Twitter and find out that the peace was happening. It took
Right.
took a little took a few time took a little time to get the word to some other places. So there were some battles that took place afterwards, and we. I guess we want to talk about the people from Kentucky, and you mentioned how Kentucky was pretty much universally for the war, and
Mm.
how it kind of was affecting trade, which is a big thing. Which almost many wars are fought over trade, and how. But I guess I want to get to is some of the big events. Maybe not so much here in Kentucky that we'll talk about and focus more on, but this is the war where Britain, burned the Washington D.C.
Right.
Not the whole place, but the White House and some of those places. Or was it the Capitol?
They burned every federal building in D.C. except the post
I was, right.
office.
I was gonna say, or was it? Because I was thinking, it was a pretty shocking kind of turn of events. A lot of stuff happened, but again, the big thing is Kentuckians were involved in a lot of this, and a lot of people talk about Revolutionary War, Civil War. This was a big conflict for Kentucky specifically, even though it's overlooked a lot. So,
Right.
Again, you alluded to this a little bit, but tell us a little bit more. Why was this so important to Kentucky, and why was Kentucky so involved?
Right. Well, this is one of my personal grievances, and I guess I'm a little biased. But if you go out and you find the DVD or a documentary on the War of 1812, it's going to almost focus exclusively on the last year of the war, 1814, because that's when the Star Spangled Banner gets written.
Yes.
That's when, as you mentioned, Washington gets burned. Shortly after, 8 days into 1815, so it's almost 1814, we have the Battle of New Orleans, which tends to be the battle that most people have heard of. And so those tend to be the highlights in people's minds. But at that point, we'd already been fighting for 2 years. And you mentioned Kentucky's role in the war. Kentucky, of all the casualties suffered in the 3-year conflict, 64% of them were Kentuckians.
Man.
And part of the reason was, you had to use what you had here in the West. It's not easy to get supplies across the mountains. You can bring some things down the Ohio River. But Kentucky was the primary defender of American territory west of the Appalachian Mountains. And so that means they served as far north as Ontario. They served as far south as New Orleans, and had generally good luck recruiting people through volunteers early in the war. They have to result in drafting kind of towards the end. But Kentuckians took this very personally. And as one example of that, as the troops are preparing to march northward to try to help at the very start of the war, it's the summer of 1812, they rendezvous at Georgetown, and they're preparing to march northward. And they're told, you have a double character to defend. As an American, people expect you to do your duty. But as a Kentuckian, they expect you to go above and beyond that. This was very personal for these guys in a sense of honor.
Yeah, well, that's very cool. Honestly, me being biased as well, but I think about that time during this time, and I'm going to show us a picture of Henry Clay here. He was very relevant during this time. This is when he was first getting started, and I guess you could say he kind of built his legacy throughout the next 30 some years. And during that time, Kentucky was a thriving place, a very important place
Absolutely.
to the whole country.
Right.
And you could even say, part of that reputation was even built from this war. And it's one of those times, I guess, prideful moments that a lot of Kentuckians don't realize how important Kentucky was during this time period.
Yeah.
Right on the Ohio River, connected to the Mississippi. Trade was, this was a big deal. And like you said before, you start messing with trade, people, of course, are going to get upset when it starts affecting them as well.
Right.
So war, or Isaac Shelby's elected. The drum beats of war are on the door. How did Kentucky just line up and march in, or how did it work?
Largely so. As you mentioned the Indian Wars earlier, Kentuckians had been sending troops and volunteers northward since the 1780s and 90s into what would become Ohio and Indiana in separate battles, because a lot of times those tribes had connections to Kentucky because it was a hunting ground or something like that. And so they would use bases, particularly centered around Chillicothe, Ohio, and that area, to launch raids into Kentucky. So Kentuckians had been trying to push any sort of native resistance back for several decades. And in 1811, of course, William Henry Harrison, then the governor of the Indiana Territory, decides to march a force up to Prophetstown, which was Tecumseh's headquarters. Tecumseh being a Shawnee chief who was kind of head of the resistance. He was building an Indian alliance. And they get close. Tecumseh's not there, but his brother launches an ambush on the American troops. They had kind of said they would want to talk the next morning. You guys camp out here, and in the night ambushed troops. And there were at least 100 Kentuckians at that battle, which became known as the Battle of Tippecanoe. And so you've got a 20-year span at least of attacks backwards and forwards that had really galvanized public opinion in Kentucky. People felt like if the state was really going to grow, if there was going to be any safety in getting goods to market, or even safety just to go hunting, in small numbers, you really had to take control of the situation. And in their mind, you can see somewhat where they're coming from. If you're ambushed and in your defense, you find out the enemy is using British-made muskets, or they're using powder that was shipped over from London, that really sours public opinion towards Great Britain, which was not great anyway. It's only been a few decades since the Revolution.
Yeah.
So that had really influenced Kentucky's public opinion. And of course, you mentioned Henry Clay, the war hawks in Congress. They're pushing Madison, who I get the impression didn't truly want the war. He's very bookish, and there's different opinions on that. He prefers to discuss trade policy rather than be on a horse, issuing orders. But war is pushed through, and barbecues happen in Kentucky. People raise their own units. There are people put on plays in Lexington so they could afford uniforms to go, because in their minds, they're fighting the revolution again.
Yeah.
And in the Kentucky Gazette, which is a newspaper out of Frankfort, they rewrote the words to Yankee Doodle to reflect the current conflict, because this is the revolution part 2 in their mind. Yeah. And so before Kentuckians can get there, Detroit falls, and it really begins to sink in that this is not going to be quick and easy. The British and the Canadian allies are dug in, and it was going to be a fight.
Yeah. Well, you talk about the revolution, and a lot of people forget about the revolutionary battles that happened in Kentucky, or that the Kentucky frontiersmen fought
Oh yeah.
against British and Native Americans as well. Um, but you talk about raising troops and all those sorts of things. A lot of this, and we mentioned this before, having a governor ride into battle with you, but a lot of like the representatives, the senators, like they went out and raised troops to get 200 troops, 500 troops to go and fight. So it's a bit different sometimes when you think about how politics worked back then. There was a bit more you know, I mean, there's still sleazy politicians, of
Oh
course,
sure.
but but there was a hands-on kind of feel sometimes that we're going to battle,
Yeah.
follow me into
Lead from
battle.
the front.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Wouldn't probably see that as much today or at all, but
Right. Yeah, we had some
uh,
big congressmen during the war who voted for the war, supported, then resigned and joined the military to fight. So you're absolutely right.
yeah, that's really putting your money where your mouth is, or uh, yeah, that's the best. That's the best adage or idiom you could say, I guess, for
Oh
the
yeah.
time. But so you mentioned this too, Detroit and so forth,
Mhm.
and the Kentucky people were on the way. How many? Because I've read this somewhere, and I'm hopefully um, Isaac Shelby. How many troops did he raise total, or how many? Um, Troops were first in that group. And let me back up. Um, George Rogers Clark, his involvement, I think I'm getting a little mixed up. He wasn't really. He died. Oh man, I'm stumbling when he died. As I think he might have died. Uh, oh gosh, I know he had a stroke. He had a stroke,
Mhm.
and he might have been out of commission by the time any of this went on. Because I
Yeah.
don't think he was involved in any way. But I wanted to make sure I was clear on that before I said something about
Yeah.
where was George Rogers Clark.
Yeah, he
But
does. He fights at the same theater. During the Revolution, he helps capture the Illinois territory, and he's
yeah,
still
that's right.
alive. And his he actually has famous family members from Kentucky who end up
Mhm.
doing pretty well. But he dies in Louisville, and
Okay.
or
Yeah,
he's living in Louisville. I think he dies there too. But yeah,
yeah, yeah. Okay. Yeah. Anyway, sorry, that was a complete complete
no,
sidetrack. So how many troops total in Kentucky
when
headed?
Shelby
What? Yeah, with
yeah,
Shelby.
when Shelby goes forward, Shelby takes about 2,000 troops with him, and that's in the summer of 1813. That's in response to the River Raisin, which I know we're going to talk about here shortly.
Yeah.
As far as the total number of Kentucky troops, that there's been all sorts of debate about how to count that and what counts and what doesn't, because there were a number of units who were activated inside the state's borders and they're
Yeah.
chasing off Indian raiders, or there are people who served in the federal army, the 17th United States Infantry and the 27th United States Infantry, and I think part of the 29th, if I'm not mistaken, was made entirely of Kentuckians. So
Wow.
they don't often get counted in the story, but they're very much a part of it. So several thousand Kentuckians participate, and I used to know the percentage of the population, the estimated percentage, and I don't
Uh-huh.
recall that now. But one of the things that made it easier to serve back then is you are automatically enrolled in the militia when you come of age. So when you're 21 years old, you join the militia, and when they muster and they drill, you're part of that. And so when the war would break out, your county would select, sometimes by lottery or sometimes by volunteer, who would go. And so your county may only send 75 to 100 guys. They're going to meet up with other units from other counties and then form a regiment that way. So every able-bodied man, with few exceptions, was at least at risk of going. So,
Mhm.
the clergy were exempted, university professors were exempted, politicians were exempted. Imagine that politicians wrote a bill that exempted politicians from service. But yeah, but yeah, most everybody really faced the challenge of going.
Yeah. And well, you mentioned it. It really becomes a bit of a collective effort. If everybody, each county is sending this many people, and you even said that pride for Kentucky. Um, so the first battle, I guess, for Kentuckians would that be Tippecanoe?
A lot of people, that's before the declaration of war officially.
Hmm.
It's November of 1811. But most people view that in the West as the start of the war because like I said, there are 100 Kentuckians there. And it doesn't really solve anything. it proves to the United States that this is going to be a war, and it also proves, to the native warriors that they're going to have to fight as well. So it kind of lights the powder keg. So I would say, in my opinion, it's the first. The first battle involving Kentuckians after the declaration of war. I'm trying to recall what fort was defended first from native attack, because the British were much better prepared for this, unfortunately, than we were. And so a number of forts in the Ohio Territory and or the state of Ohio and the Indiana Territory fall under attack pretty quickly. So we are scrambling early in the war to get troops to those places to reinforce them. So that's where the war begins for Kentucky in earnest, is defending those forts and planning to retake Michigan. Because when Detroit is placed under siege, it's surrendered without firing a shot. And we talked about General Hull earlier, and he's an older gentleman. He was really in over his head. He was asked to fight because he had been a Revolutionary War veteran, but he was really out of his league, and the British bluff him into surrendering. And when he surrenders Detroit, Michigan's not that populated. So what he basically does is surrender to the British the entire Michigan territory and the northern parts of Indiana and Ohio that are within ship range of the Great Lakes. So, I mean, shortly after that, when Kentuckians are defending some of those forts in the Ohio Territory, it's a very real threat that Cincinnati could become the new international border between the U.S. and Canada. So, yeah, that was probably the genesis of it for Kentucky, and it just gets more interesting from there.
Yeah, the big warning sign. That brings Canada a little bit closer than we might want, or
Yeah.
British at the time, I guess, or because Canada was a British territory, and I don't know when Canada got its independence or anything like that, but somebody can Google that for us and tell us later.
Yeah.
So that's pretty important, because all this stuff goes on, and you don't think of the Great Lakes being this big battle area, but like it is. It's a big, huge naval battle. It goes on there, which I don't know how many Kentuckians would be involved in the naval part of the battle, but Oliver Hazard Perry rose in there.
Right.
Big battles. What's his quote?
The enemy,
and they're ours.
Yeah.
They're ours. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and
you mentioned Kentuckians, and you're right. For most Kentuckians, the farm pond, or maybe the Ohio River when you crossed it, that's the biggest body of water you've seen. But mentioning Perry, there's an interesting anecdote with that, is that Perry has the men to sail his vessels, but what he really needs is someone who can shoot at the enemy on deck. And so he borrows from the force that Shelby's marching with northward about 100 Kentucky militia who have never been on a ship in their life. And there are stories about them going through the ship and looking in cabins and going in the captain's cabin, and they're, dude, you can't do that. And they try to warn them. Your job is get behind a barrel, climb some rigging, whatever you need to do, and just fire at the people on the deck of the enemy ships. And so we have no idea how many or how effective they were, but we do know that years later, the Commonwealth of Kentucky had medals struck and given to the men who survived, who had done that. So
that's cool. That's super cool.
Yeah.
That's so funny. They brought the Kentucky boys onto the ship, and it's like, what's going on in here, guys?
Whole different world. Yeah.
But side note too, Oliver Hazard Perry County and Hazard, Kentucky, both named after him. So pretty cool. So do what now?
Perryville.
Yeah, so, there you go. Those I guess are the Tippecanoe after that. So let's talk about Detroit, and the Kentucky men are headed up there to defend, or to, I guess, get back up, because Detroit is very important, obviously. And this is the company that Isaac Shelby is with, or is there
not yet? Yeah,
not yet. That's right. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, Detroit. It's unfortunate, really, and you wonder sometimes in history. You have those moments where you think, what were they thinking? And this was one of those moments for us, because Congress declares war in June of 1812, and the British are not going to find out for a little bit. They have representatives here and there, or they have people with their ear to the ground who are going to pass this word primarily through New York State into Canada and that kind of thing. But the British find out amazingly quickly. we decide to let folks in the Michigan Territory know about the declaration of war by sending a letter. Not the best way to get the news sent quickly, especially at this time.
Yeah.
And one of the interesting anecdotes I found in the book is there are some Kentucky militia who are marching northward, and they're preparing to go reinforce Detroit. That's their job, and they're going to be there, and they're going to launch an attack into Canada. And on the way up, the baggage ship, they have some sick and wounded, so they're put on Lake Erie and sailed towards Detroit. And they sail close to the Canadian border because they haven't received word that war's been declared yet. They know it's coming. Yeah. And so the ship, with all of their baggage, including tallies of how many soldiers you have, how many well versus how many sick, what your ammunition is like, correspondence between officers, all of that is captured because the British know war's been declared and we don't. So, yeah, it took a while. And then Hull actually crosses the border into Canada when they find out. It's the first invasion of a foreign country by an American force, really since the Revolution, because that's more of a civil war. We're fighting Britain. We didn't invade Canada in the Revolution, but this is the first time. And, he's there for a few weeks. He retreats to Detroit. And again, the British have excellent officers who read the situation well, and they bluff the American force into surrendering. Yeah. And women and children are released. And then at that point, we've got to recover. So we're already down a point, basically.
Yeah, it is. It's one of those things. It is very hard looking back at history, and you think, what were they thinking? Why did they? But weren't there. And by any means, I'm not a military advisor or know anything to begin with.
The serious part is, one day I feel like someone's going to say that about me in 75 years. They're going to find out I did something or read something. And what was he thinking? And they'll be right,
What was that idiot thinking, man? What was he thinking? Yeah. So apologies for all those mistakes, that have happened and will continue to happen. So you bring it up too. I want to, you talk about the whole sending a letter. I'm trying to think of the path that they would have went to get to the Michigan Territory, and versus the British going up north through New York State and to Canada that way, and obviously that would have been a lot faster.
British attachés and folks like that can get information, and we don't know how they found out, or at least I don't know how they found out about the war, but I suspect, like you say, it went by water, either up through New York State into the area that way, or maybe by water up to Quebec and then passed on. But yeah, they find out very quickly. For Kentuckians, the route northward, and it's interesting because it sounds so far away, but really Ontario is closer to Kenton County than Paducah is. Kentucky's a long state. So, as weird as that sounds, if you put Kentucky on its side, you'll be right at the border with Canada. So for Kentuckians, you had men who came from each county, and usually you rendezvoused at a river county. Now, in 1812, when they're marching northward, they rendezvous at first at Georgetown in Scott County. And then they marched northward from there to Newport. And there was a federal army barracks in Newport, so if you had to have a gun repaired or something like that, you could get that taken care of. And then they cross into Cincinnati. And a lot of the places mentioned, if you look at the letters that are left behind, St. Mary's, Ohio, the Maumee Rapids, up near Toledo, you can follow their route today, and it's kind of neat to see.
Yeah, that's really cool. And that happens too. I mean, if you go back even towards, frontiersmen, Daniel Boone and them, they followed buffalo trails, and there's a good chance those buffalo trails were hammered out and good places to put a road and so forth. Well, I just think of like driving up 75. You could drive up 75, especially from here to Cincinnati and upward and onward. And that is interesting too. The whole. It's very true. If you turn Kentucky over, it would touch Canada.
Yeah. So it is fascinating. And of course, they're creating a line of forts as they go. So it's in your interest as a soldier that you want your unit to march from fort to fort, because being called out at nightfall in the Indiana Territory is a really dangerous place to be.
Yeah.
So it helps us have protection, but at the same time, it shows the enemy what route we're taking.
Yeah, and well, and you know, you say that, and I'm just compelled to throw it back to about 1770, 1780. Fort Harrod, Fort Boonesborough, Fort Logan. Uh, there was a Whitley station.
Yeah.
Those stations that people made on their way because you did not want to be caught out at night without a structure or someplace that is safe for protection. And that's what they did. That's what they did when they first came over here from Virginia and North Carolina and all those places was building those forts along the way. Here you go. 50 years later, they're doing the same thing, or
Oh yeah.
40 maybe. I
Yeah,
don't know. I
roughly.
don't
Yeah.
know my
And,
math.
and stop me if I'm rambling, but there is a story where a Kentucky unit is in search of some enemy tribesmen, and they end up camping in the woods. And at this point, they're going into Illinois, so it's flat, it's grassy, it's very dry. And in the middle of the night, someone smells smoke, and they realize the Indians have been shadowing them. And at this point, they're all in camp, they're asleep. The Indians have set fire to the prairie nearby, and if they hadn't noticed it and gotten up in time to escape, they would have been engulfed.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a dangerous place to be.
Wow. Well, that's that's fine. Ramble all you want as far as that goes, because again, we can talk about Kentucky history for days. So as they begin, they're going fort to fort, marching north. What was the strategy? Did they have, or I mean, I guess if I can recall, did they want to break up into
Hmm.
three units, I guess? And I say units again. My military terms are not necessarily correct, but is that right? Or
It does, yeah. The U.S. had floated a plan initially that they were going to attack from three different directions. They were going to cross at Niagara. They were going to attack where Detroit is, and that falls apart early on. So what happens is William Henry Harrison is marching north to try to recover Detroit. He realizes he's not going to make it in time. He needs to bed down for the winter. It gets wet and cold in Michigan very early in the year. And so the plan is he's going to break his wing now up into threes. He's going to spread them out, and that way you're not all eating the same food. You can forage more readily. It's just easier to keep you supplied in the winter. He's going to break them up into threes. He's going to leave them there until the ground freezes over in about January, maybe early February. And then when they can move wagons and cannons, they're going to march north and recapture Detroit. And the British really do not have the manpower to defend it. And the problem is they get part of the way up there, they have to stop, and in that period where they're waiting for the ground to freeze, there's not much food. There's not a lot of clothing. It's very Valley Forge like. And at one
yeah.
point, the Kentuckians even name one of their camps Fort Starvation because they are in deep trouble. So that's part of the problem. Of course, that leads up to what happens with the Battle of the River Raisin.
hmm
And
Well, I'll pause right there because I got a good question here before we get into um, the battle, I guess, or those sorts of things. What was your primary resource on this? I mean, was the journals and that stuff? Was what you got most
I,
of?
I tried to rely heavily on that because there hadn't been any good use made of it in recent years. There had been plenty of journals and things used to write the story on the other side of the mountains,
Yeah,
but no one had really focused on Western history. So the Historical Society in Frankfort, University of Kentucky, places like that had a wealth of information that I frankly did not really think existed
yeah,
anymore. And there are journals because this is going to make you famous. You're 19 years old, you're marching away from home. What are you going to spend the few dollars you have on? Well, you're going to buy a journal and you're going to write down what happens. You can tell everybody when
yeah,
you get back.
yeah.
And several of those survive, and they're fascinating stuff. So
Well,
that, and then Governor Shelby's papers survive.
hmm well, that's what the one thing I wanted to. I kind of was assumed that was what your was journals and stuff, but like that would be. That's so cool. Like I would love to just read one of the journals and follow that soldier through their journey, I guess. Because when I'm thinking of in any historical setting, if you get a journal is so valuable because you're getting somebody's
Absolutely.
daily things. But like and I guess I just that's so cool because like you get these journals and you can see what they were thinking, what they were going through. Because sometimes even when I'm researching something, newspaper articles is fairly good,
Right.
Newspapers articles can also be a little biased depending on the situation as well. Um, but then, sometimes like if I Google War of 1812, people in Kentucky, I'm just going to get this, overview of something. I'm not
Right.
going to get those, big time journals. And, you think about Daniel Boone, he got an autobiography written about him. So everybody kind of knows all that stuff.
Absolutely.
You look at, you know, uh, James Herod, not as much known about him because there wasn't that ironclad. Here's some stuff that happened. Or Benjamin Logan does have a book written about him, but it was written like, you know, I think like 100 years after he
Yeah.
died. So it's not.
Boone had a better
It's
publicist.
good. It's
Right.
fine, but not that firsthand. Here's what happened, kind of stuff. That's really, yeah, it's really cool. But me being a little nerdy as well, I guess. But
No, yeah, it's the good stuff because you're really hearing people's thoughts. And one collection of letters the Historical Society in Frankfurt has is from a husband and wife, where they wrote backwards and forwards, and that was neat too, because he marches to Canada. It's near the end of the war, and he's going to go fight, and he's going to defend the United States. And when he gets up there, there's a little fighting to be done at this point. So he's sitting in the wilderness, and she talks about, I had a dream the other night that you were beside me, and I rolled over and you weren't there. And he writes back that, we marched today, and this isn't fun at all like I thought it would. I wish I was home with you. And so you
yeah,
get these points of view that,
yeah,
again, people don't tend to attribute to the 19th century, but that
yeah.
human emotion's there, and that's really cool.
That is really that's really cool. You say these are all in Frankfurt and UK.
Yeah, absolutely.
We might need to get them and publish them and all
Yeah,
that,
we'll
all
make a
that
road
good
trip.
stuff. Yeah. So as we were saying, they divided up into three, and they're marching north. How's that going for them? Though you said too that their supplies are running out. They call it was it camp starvation?
Yes, at one point. And
Yeah.
the only thing worse for a Kentuckian than you have folks from Tennessee in the audience, so I apologize, I'm sure. But the only thing worse for a Kentuckian than being hungry is being commanded by a Tennessean. And Harrison divides his force up. He's with a different wing of the army,
Yeah.
and he puts the Kentuckians under James Winchester, who is, as far as we know, a very capable officer. He's from Tennessee, and the Kentuckians torment this poor fella on the march northward. At one point, they sabotage his outhouse lavatory situation with a porcupine skin, so he ends up poked pretty well.
Oh gosh, hold on. So they put a porcupine in his outhouse, and he
Yes,
sits on it.
yeah. Without going into too much detail, he had a special spot that he used, and they sabotaged it with the porcupine skin. At another point, they sabotaged it so that he would fall over, and in the muck and the mire. And
Yeah,
so this poor fella is having to put up with this as they march northward. So that's while they were obviously wrong to do that, it
yeah,
shows the level of discontent they have before supplies even run low.
yeah,
And so now you have that, plus you have the idleness of
yeah,
waiting in the cold. And one thing that Shelby does at the time is they realize it's not a quick and easy victory. So he asked the women of Kentucky to sew socks and blankets and shoes and coats. And the civilians here really rally to that, and they send boatloads northward. And that makes it somewhat easier to bear.
yeah.
But the glorious battles just hadn't come.
Well, 2 points from all that is one, like you just said, kind of the pride of Kentucky. That kind of, I feel that's still something very relevant today. People are very prideful of
Absolutely.
being from Kentucky, living in Kentucky, very loyal, and I kind of get that feeling with these. With that, making Shelby rallying the everyday citizen. Hey, we gotta support these troops. We get this stuff out there. And then the other point is the hatred for Tennessee was way before the orange and blue were going at it. It was.
It was. It was. That made it worse. But,
Oh yeah, but Tennessee's great
oh
sometimes.
yeah,
If you're from Tennessee, we
yeah.
appreciate you listening.
And in the New Orleans they fight side by side. So it's
Yeah,
just something about this one particular fella. So I
yeah,
say that in jest, but yeah, that was part of their discontentment.
yeah, yeah. Well, that that's a great spot to end it on, I believe, and or at least for this overview. And we're gonna have some more. We're gonna have David come back on as many times as we can have him, and talk a little bit about the next kind of big event that Kentuckians will be involved at. We've covered it a little bit on the History Channel, the Kentucky History Channel, and you can check out some videos on that. But we're going to get to Frenchtown, River Raisin. A sad day for Kentuckians, I guess, if you want to say that. So we'll end this on a happy note that a guy from Tennessee got poked by a porcupine. So, David, hey, thanks for coming on. We really appreciate it, and we will have you on again soon. Anything else before we go?
No, just my pleasure. Thank you for the opportunity. And again, Kentucky history is so important. So it's great what you guys are doing to highlight that.
Thank you. And before we go don't forget, you can get David's book, The War of 1812 in the West, Amazon, Barnes & Noble. Basically type in David Kirkpatrick, The War of 1812 in the West, and it's going to come up. So highly recommend you go out and get it and get more familiar with the forgotten part of the War of 1812, which is the War of 1812 is probably also the forgotten war.
Yeah,
but yeah. So again, thanks for listening, and thanks for coming on, David, and we'll see everybody soon. And thanks for listening.
Thanks. Take care.
Welcome to the Kentucky History Channel, where we strive to bring you all the Kentucky history content you want and you deserve. Kentucky is a part of all of us, and we plan on covering all the history we can, from Pike County to Fulton County, from Louisville to Harlan. Here on our YouTube channel, you can find many videos dedicated to different events, people, governors, and places in Kentucky. There's something for everybody. While you're here, if you like the channel, hit the subscribe button and the notification button so you get notified anytime new Kentucky history is available. And if you want to support the channel, we have a Patreon page as well, or patreon.com/kyhistorypod. You've probably heard about Daniel Boone, but what about the rest of the frontiersmen who came to Kentucky and settled? That's what we want to bring to the Kentucky History Channel. The stories of the untold, the stories of those forgotten. One thing to expect on our channel is great Kentucky content. Some stories that you've never heard of. The Night Riders, who began in western Kentucky. Bloody Monday, the riots in Louisville. The assassination of Governor Goebel, the only governor ever assassinated in the United States. Stories from all over Kentucky, stories that are unforgettable once you've heard them. You can find out who counties in Kentucky are named after and how your county got started. From beginning to end, we plan to document every county in Kentucky, all 120. Reach out to us on all of our social media platforms. Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And also leave a comment on one of our YouTube videos. You can also check out our podcast episodes. You can subscribe to our podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and many more. We're always seeking to find more Kentucky history so we can bring it to you. The viewers, the listeners, we want all the stories and all the events from Kentucky's great history to be told and shared everywhere.